It was a big group of creepypasta authors in the early 20th century. Hello geeks and girls, we're closing the end of October, so yes, no more daily videos for you of me talking about horror stories, but you know what, since we're here, let's talk about yet another Cthulhu Mythos stories. And today I've got some Frank Belknap Long for you, and you probably wonder who's this guy. Well, he used to be one of Lovecraft's friends. He has written a biography of Lovecraft, which I have yet to read, and he was one of the close members of the Cthulhu Lovecraft Circle, actually, in Trolley 1852. Lovecraft names drop him, so that's quite interesting. And today we'll talk about the Hound of Tindalos. Well, that story is not the most important story in Cthulhu Mythos. It's not even the most important story in Frank Belknap Long. However, it is a great example of the seeds that Howard Phillips Lovecraft has planted in his stories, and how his contemporaries and those who decided to continue in his work, his mythos cycle, his Cthulhu cycle, his Cthulhu Mythos stories, have borrowed and expanded from it. And the Hound of Tindalos is borrowing from two Lovecraft stories. It's borrowing from maybe three. It's definitely borrowing a lot from Dreams in the Witch House. Definitely has a lot to do with the Hound. I believe that retrospectively, the Hound from the story, the Hound is identified as one of the Hounds of Tindalos, and I think there is a lot of there are some elements from the Silver Key and from Beyond the Eons, I believe, or is it not Beyond the Eons? What's that story with Out of the Eons, I think. I have a brain fart right now. There's the story about the guy who has swapped minds with a prehistorical creature. So what's the story about? We have our nameless protagonist who visits a very Lovecraftian character. Chalmers is a friend of his. He is an author of dark fiction, of occult horror, etc. And he has a mad plan. He's looking for something way beyond the natural. He is looking beyond what science says, because he thinks that scientists are cowards and they cannot accept the unexpected, the occult. However, he embraces the very Lovecraftian idea that math is actually a form of magic, or magic is a form of maths, like in Dreams in the Witch House, where the occult is some sort of science that we cannot yet understand. And he plans to use a very special drug that came from the East as a way to invade the past, using some geometrical signs taken out of Einstein and occult tomes. And he wants his friend to write down what he's saying. So he takes the drug and he goes into a recursion. He is starting to enumerate different places he is in human history until he reaches the Big Bang, and there he realizes that time is comprised of two different things, of curves and of corners. And the curves is the world we can understand, and corners are something different, and creatures live there. And those creatures, the Hounds of Tindalos, catch his scent. So his friend wakes him up because he's terrified and he is a wreck. The very next day, Chalmers calls his friend to bring him some stucco, which he uses to cover every corner in his room because he knows that the hounds only come through corners. So if there are no corners in his room, there's no way the hounds will catch him because they're after him. However, the next day an earthquake happens and people find Chalmers torn to bits. His head is cut from his body, and this part of the story is not narrated by our protagonist. Instead, it is given as articles or reports in a very Lovecraftian style, because during the earthquake pieces of stucco fell, so there were corners for the hounds to come in, and possibly this earthquake was caused by other creatures that live between the corners and curves. So it's a very Lovecraftian story. It's quite competent, nothing to write home about. However, I won't talk about the story because the seeds were there, and Lovecraft was much less interested in world building. He was just throwing ideas out there, and he was using his mythology of the Great Old Ones in his stories. In his stories he ghost wrote as Easter eggs. He allowed his friend to use those to mention his gods and the tomes, and he did the same for works by his friends, like for instance mentioning Tsathoggua, which was created by Clark Astor's myth, or Cult de Ghouls, I think, De Vermis Mysteries, that Robert Bloch, or it was Fritz Lieber that created De Vermis Mysteries. So yes, it was a big group of creepypasta authors in the early 20th century, basically, and they were borrowing ideas of each other and mentioning things of each other. And after Lovecraft died, his disciples started building upon his ideas. Ted Klein's story in his novella The Black Man with a Horn, we have pretty much Frank Belknap Long starring. That he was the inspiration for the main character of that novella. And I think that Long is the archetypical student of Lovecraft. He was a pulp author that never became famous. He wrote some mythos stories. He was close to Lovecraft, definitely one of his favorites, but he was not August Derleth. He didn't go out and publish everything that Lovecraft has written as or compress, or take fragments of his stories and finish them and present them as collaboration, or even stamp the name of Lovecraft on original stories of his because they were in his spirit, like Derleth did. And I don't like Derleth. I don't like August Derleth at all. That's why he's missing from this. I went through most of the big Cthulhu authors. I didn't do Leiber though. I didn't do any Fritz Leiber because I don't quite like his horror stories. The horror stories of his I've read, they didn't strike me well, but we went through Howard, Clark Astor Smith, we went through Robert Bloch, Ramsey Campbell, not Lumley too. We have these legends of horror, and they all started off following Lovecraft and being members of his cycle. And Long is he is one of those names you will find in anthologies, but he never became great. He's just a side note. His career is carried by Hardhop's Lovecraft. And yes, reading the story, you can get why it's not a great story. But it's something about the legacy of the Cthulhu Mythos. It's how he takes ideas of giants and reuses them, how he builds upon them to add something new to the whole structure, to the whole mythos, a new element. Maybe a side note, or identifying something that has happened in the past, so he's connecting threads in Lovecraft's very loose framework of the Great Old Ones. After all, the mythos we know today is created by Derleth and Long and other authors trying to make sense, to build upon Lovecraft's work. It's not the Cthulhu Mythos as we see it in pop culture, in in Chaosiums, The Call of Cthulhu, or other media. It's not Lovecraftian exactly. It's built upon disciples of him, and that's important. Things added by these authors, by Lovecraft's students, or by people who never met Lovecraft. The last Cthulhu Mythos story written by somebody in the inner circle was in the 70s by Robert Bloch, when he wrote Stranger Eons, and very rare novel. I think I've got a copy somewhere in there from the Greek pulps I have amassed. But yeah, it's like that. It's people like Long who gave us the Cthulhu Mythos, not Lovecraft. It's people who remember the man, were inspired by the man, and continued his work. We owe to them to remember the names and their work, because they may be side notes. I mean, greater Cthulhu Mythos authors like Fritz Lieber have been forgotten, and Robert Bloch is mostly well known for Psycho or his Twilight Zone stories, even though he was super important in instilling the love of horror on many modern authors like Stephen King or Richard Lehman, because they grew up in his stories. So we owe to these people to read them, to know them, to celebrate them, because the reason we know of Lovecraft is them, not anybody else. And even though I may not be the biggest Darloth fan, here's the reason we know Lovecraft. Nobody knew of Lovecraft when he was alive, and we know him simply because of Darloth and his editorial work. We know of Howard because of Frank Belknap, who was the editor who collected the Conan stories and often ghost wrote a lot of stories to create a cohesive thread of his life. We owe to these people, and many authors started based on the works of these people. Like, for instance, Robert Jordan. He was a Conan pastiche writer before he wrote The Wheel of Time. Or Robert Bloch was writing Cthulhu stories before he wrote Psycho. Or I'm not sure Richard Matheson was writing any Cthulhu stories though. But Fritz Lieber was there. All those people. So let's celebrate them this October, this spooky season. Let's celebrate all those people. It's the reason. It's our link to that past, to those greats. So it wasn't about the story, as you understand. This video wasn't about the story, but there was nothing to say about the story really. It was a very typical myth story. It was entertaining, I'll give you that. I appreciated it a lot. It followed all the cliches. It was very Lovecraftian in its vision, not that original. But you know what, it's not about originality always. Sometimes it's more about all the other stuff that come with the story. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I'd love to hear your opinions about it. Leave a comment below. If you are still here and you haven't done so already, like, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much for watching. Stay spooky.